Welcome to the Accounting Technology Lab, sponsored by CPA Practice Advisor, with your hosts, Randy Johnston and Brian Tankersley.
Good day. Welcome to the Accounting Technology Lab. I'm your host, Randy Johnston, with co-host Brian Tankersley, and we are lucky enough to have a guest with us today, Will Zacher, who we discovered with his company Agency Partners had done some things on the CPA exam and a few findings that we thought were worthwhile. So, Brian, I'm just reminded that you've taught CPA exam content for a long time. Just remind our listeners of your history there.
Yes. So I started out teaching CPA. My first teaching job actually was teaching CPA review in January of 1997 with Becker. And I worked with them till about 2013. And then starting about 2015 or 16, I did some work with Zacher CPA review, including going to the CPA exam provider meeting in New York at AICPA. So I've got a long history of spending time with folks, figuring out these kinds of problems, and it's kind of how I got to this dance.
Yeah, that I knew you had some dance experience, if you will, so 25 years plus. And so, Will, I'm not going to try to fill in an introduction for you. What would you like our listeners to know about you and your company?
Yeah, sure. So our company agency provides financial automation solutions for CPAs, and our working paper came out of some internal benchmark testing that we were doing. We realized it could be beneficial to the industry, so we decided to publish our findings and make it public.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. And what caught my eye on this was that some of your key findings were how ChatGPT and, of course, Claude Opus had passed multiple choice sections of the CPA exam in both auditing and financial reporting. That was kind of one of the key findings. What should we know about that finding?
So ChatGPT-4, there was a paper that came out last year in which the researchers were able to modify ChatGPT-4 to get it to pass the CPA exam, but our testing involved what's called zero-shot prompting, which means that we don't provide any context to the model around what it's going to solve. We just copy and pasted the questions in there, and it was able to solve it and have passing scores on every section without any manipulation by our team. So both of those models are good choices for asking general questions that have to do with the CPA exam. ChatGPT-4 performed very well in almost every section. Cloud Opus performed extremely well, and best in class for the regulatory section. But yeah, both of those models performed well. And then Google Gemini actually performs extremely well in business analytics, which is a relatively newer section to the CPA exam. And one of the major takeaways there is that their model has a larger memory, almost 10x the next model's memory, in terms of the data that's able to digest and use when it's making its decisions in production. So if you're going to use that in an applied setting, Gemini Pro might be a better solution than either Cloud or
Makes good sense. Now, Brian and I, again, have followed these AI models since before inception or before release. And, as we take a look back and think about the ChatGPT release in November of 22, and then how it all unfolded last year, of course, we thought that Microsoft's Copilot, when it was released, actually did a better, more accurate job than ChatGPT-4 did at that point in time. And of course, when Bard was updated, now called Gemini, in December, we thought it did better. And when Claude 3 was introduced, we thought it did better. And I'm not going to keep naming models, but you get the idea, friends, that when it comes to accounting related data, Brian and I are routinely testing these models on responses for queries in different sections. That's why Will's team's results here were interesting, because they were trying to be thoughtful about this. And, as we get to conclusions from large language models into smaller models, which Brian and I have talked to you about in a prior podcast, as we go from large to medium to small to narrow models, they each do different things well. And we're going to continue to see new announcements like Microsoft's Phi recently, or the new search engines like Perplexity, which are using these types of models to try to offset older technologies. So it looked like to me, Will, that you had actually, considered Mixtral and Llama 2B and some others against the Becker exam when you were getting this result. But, the second major conclusion, I think, is exactly the same one that we've been using, that humans have to monitor this AI result. Human accountants are not going to be obsolete. So what would you have us know about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the major application of AI in accounting is probably not going to be, people talk about replacing jobs and things like that. It's unlikely to be that. It's much more likely to allow for manual automation on reconciliation of accounts and things like that, because current automation tools are much more rule-based and they're very rigid, whereas a lot of accounting decisions tend to be a little bit more contextual. And so these models have the capability of translating those contextual requirements into automations at the most time-intensive tasks that really don't deserve the time of someone who has a CPA or a CFO controller type role. We think that's going to be the biggest area of improvement where people are going to see AI affect accounting the most.
And one of the observations that Brian and I have made is that generally the large language models don't do math well. A lot of people have been trying to solve that problem. And in another accounting technology lab, we talked about Digits, which we think was one of the first products that actually was trying to solve the math problem for reporting. And of course, we've talked in multiple other podcasts about for impact data or data advisory tools. So, in terms of this, math part of the exam, what do you think your results were showing in the accuracy of number manipulation?
Yeah, so the number part is more these models are extremely good at writing Python code, which allows them to sort of get past a lot of the mathematical problems that they might run into. And then obviously the CPA test exam, like the multiple choice questions, aren't extremely math intensive, so they can be solved with Python. So it's like that instead of these models actually interpreting the math and understanding it, it's writing Python code and then executing that code to be able to solve these problems, which could also explain why some of the open source tooling might not have that functionality built into it, and therefore struggled like Llama 2B on some of the more math intensive questions.
So in any case, so a lot of these models, as it turns out, we've recommended people are using them to write scripts, to write code and so forth. And they are actually being used by bad actors to do a lot of that today. It turns out that I think your third conclusion was that that Claude Opus was the strongest in the auditing sector. Now, again, I always turn to co-host Brian on this stuff because he introduces himself as a recovering auditor in many of our conversations because he's done both internal and external auditing. But what did you think of the Claude Opus did better in auditing compared to ChatGPT-4, which was dominating the financial reporting and regulatory environment?
Well, I think the reason that it did better on auditing is because it had access, most likely. So Anthropic is the company that put out Cloud Opus, and they've got a partnership with Amazon. They probably have larger financial data sets, and therefore have more, training data that's available, that's related to, audit related questions. A lot of these sections, all of these models. So if you look at the performance of Cloud Opus and ChatGPT-4, it's easy to compare them against human test takers. But when you look at these models' performance on things like being able to understand multi-step questions, they also test well for that. So it's possible that because Cloud Opus and ChatGPT-4 are both capable of interpreting multiple choice questions better than other models, they were able to perform better on these tasks because it was better, easier to understand. CPA test exam, exam materials should be pretty standardized, and therefore the access of true CPA training data for any of these models should be relatively similar across all the LLMs available, and therefore a lot of the performance differences would come down to things like being able to chunk the questions into something that it can interpret and then retrieve the right responses for.
Mhm. Yeah. So it does make sense to me. Of course, I have a bit of a bias personally for the Anthropic methodology because I like the rails that they defined. So the constitution and rails of Anthropic seem to be stronger than what ChatGPT is doing. Although, we know that these models continue to leapfrog each other. So perhaps that guided that. I am not sure on that conclusion. But, so from that, those were kind of the big three findings. What other things do you believe that you learned along the way of trying to test these models against the CPA exams?
Mixtral actually performed extremely well on a lot of the sections. It just had wild amounts of variability. It had by far the most variability, in some cases like up to 10% in terms of its outputs. And so I know that there are some companies that are working on expanding the context window for Mixtral, and the benefits of this could be significant cost savings for people who are using LLMs in production, because Mixtral is open source. It's free to use. You can also choose the chip infrastructure that you run it on. So if you wanted to run it on LPUs like the Grok infrastructure, you'll get responses much quicker, which could enable you to perform accounting automation actions much faster than the traditional API calls through GPT-4 or Cloud Opus. So I think there's a huge opportunity with Mixtral and getting a model that can, as long as you can pass through the appropriate information through the prompt, reduce the costs of utilizing AI in a production level environment.
And, Will, good point on the cost and production, because with the discontinuance of the Intel chipsets on May 24th for Gen 13 and the introduction of Gen 14 chipsets, one of the things we've been asking all of our professionals to do in their future purchases is look at and adopt neural processing units. In other words, the Intel Core Ultra to handle some of this AI load distributed. Now, again, you wouldn't know this about us, but I think as early as 2016, Brian and I began recommending GPUs, dedicated GPUs, knowing that we put AI loads on them into the future. And that's served us pretty well. But as we look at the new Apple M4 chips and the new phone chips and so forth, the models are going to wind up running on the edge more. So, I think your point is probably to some of the centralized resources that are available. So, Brian, I know you were trying to get in a question, and I've kept you pretty quiet today. Sorry about that, friend.
I was good. I guess, Will, the question I was going to ask is that were there particular areas within each of the subject areas of the CPA exam? Of course, you did this on the legacy CPA exam that just ended recently, because that's what you had data on. But were there particular subjects or topics that the AI was better or worse at? Or what kinds of trends did you see within those? Like, the regulation piece has tax, and it has PCAOB, and it has a number of other things in it. Talk to me a little bit about how the AI engines handle different areas on the CPA exam.
Yeah, definitely. So AI models, almost all the AI models we tested on the bar section of the exam performed exceedingly well. And actually there was very little differentiation. So to give you an example, ChatGPT-4 scored 89% on average, Gemini was 88%, and Cloud Opus was 87%. Even Mixtral, which had no fine tuning or prompt engineering or anything, scored an 80% out of the box. And so on business business analytics reporting, it's going to you can pretty much use any AI model for that. Whereas regulation by far had some of the highest variability in terms of responses, and that one really most AIs struggled with, which was interesting to us, especially because on regulation, that was the section that we found human test takers seem to do the best on overall. There's a pass rate of about 60%, meaning that most people are probably scoring in the low 80 percentile on that test, although it's kind of difficult to tell because we couldn't find reliable sources for the scores of each individual person, but our assumption is that they're relatively normally distributed around the pass rate. So the other area where we saw significant variation between models was audit and financial accounting and reporting. Both of those really separated between open source models, really fell off in those two sections, whereas ChatGPT and Cloud Opus were able to perform the best in those areas. Let's see here. Yeah, I mean, those are the other major takeaways.
Okay.
Else.
Very interesting. Very interesting. So so we were having a discussion before we get started here. What's kind of your take on whether or not accounting professionals should be nervous about this, or which ones should be nervous about the launch of AI?
I think actually accountants should be really excited for this, because there's nothing worse than getting a list of transactions and data sets and having to go back through and chase down the answers, where you've got these great accounting systems like Xero or QuickBooks that can store data, but the context around the transactions themselves up until this point have been stored by people, by employees. And so if people leave the company or whatever, that information's gone. Whereas LLMs can embed that information directly into the transaction database. And so you can get answers around questions much easier and faster this way. So it should improve the ability for accountants to perform audits, or especially fractional CFOs to come in and perform, hit the ground running when they start with a new company, being able to get the information they need instantly. And then also the time savings earlier of being able to embed accounting automations with the context around the transactions to save time on manual tasks is going to be fantastic. I mean, so you'll spend more time on modeling, more time on strategy, and much less time on simple information retrieval.
Very nice.
So, Will, I know also from our opening conversations that you're going back and forth between Buffalo and West Palm Beach. But I suspect it's because you're working on your upcoming product, AI agent Donna. Now, it looks like that's going to do full accounting automation and will integrate with some accounting systems and CRMs and ERPs. So what would you want our listeners to know about Donna?
Yeah, so Donna, as it comes out, is going to. We found a lot of people love the AIs. They're not, but the AIs can't really do much for them. So what we're doing is building out the technical infrastructure to allow accountants and CPAs to automate their transactions with context. So being able to embed the context directly into their systems. We're currently in a pilot right now to do some very simple accounting. They're simple accounting transaction automation, which is just journal entry pattern recognition. But the underlying technology should allow us to automate a lot of the accounting functions through that. And so the way that Donna is going to work is it will be able to use the accounting software much like a lower level employee to perform actions with the context of your business and save, we're going for hopefully save days or weeks of time for, the accounting and finance teams.
All right. So it sounds like this tool should be useful to client accounting services groups as well as accounting departments within industry businesses. as it's released.
Oh yeah, definitely.
And what kind of timetable do you have on this being the product going into beta or becoming commercially available?
We expect it to be commercially available July 1st. So we're in testing right now for the next 2 months, and then we should be able to release beginning of Q3.
Wonderful. Well, our guest today has been Will Zacher from Agency Partners. Again, their study on the CPA exam. We've read several of these, and people deny, oh yeah, you can't get the bar exam or the medical exam or the CPA exam passed. But I think his study basically showed that you can with the legacy exams. We know we're going to be going into a different time period here, but we wanted to have you hear his perspective on the AI models and the possibilities. So, Will, thank you for your time today. And we wish you greatest success with your new product, Donna. And again, I hope our listeners have picked up an idea or two from you along the way.
Yeah, thank you, Randy. Thank you, Brian. Thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.
All right.
You guys.
Good day.
All right.
Thank you for sharing your time with us. We'll be back next Saturday with a new episode of the Technology Lab from CPA Practice Advisor. Have a great week.